nerds, what's up? So the other day I was just thinking about men writing women, as one does, and I had the thought of, is women writing men a thing? Why don't we talk about that as much? It has to be a thing, right? And if so, what does it look like? Sorry, is that not also what you guys are thinking about before going to bed? Just in case you aren't familiar with the term, I am talking about the meme of men writing women, not just the idea of male authors writing female characters. This slang phrase was popularized by a subreddit created to mock poor writing of female characters by male authors. Although it's hard to find the exact origin of the phrase, legend has it that the subreddit was inspired by the now famous 2016 meme that popularized "she breasted boobily down the stairs." In case you've never seen the meme, it was originally written by the user Scott Beowulf and says, "Male writers writing female characters. Cassandra woke up to the rays of the sun streaming through the slats on her blinds, cascading over her naked chest. She stretched, her breasts lifting with her arms as she greeted the sun. She rolled out of bed and put on a shirt, her nipples prominently showing through the thin fabric. She breasted boobily to the stairs and titted downwards." The phrase "men writing women" is a pretty popular turn of phrase, and I've just noticed that the idea or phrase of women writing men just doesn't really exist in the same way, and so we're going to talk about that today after the jump. So let's start off the video talking a little bit first about men writing women. So this phrase usually applies to men writing women through what we call the male gaze, a term coined by Laura Mulvey in a 1975 feminist essay. In a world ordered by sexual imbalance, pleasure in looking has been split between active male and passive female. The determining male gaze projects its fantasy onto the female figure, which is styled accordingly. The male gaze, as popularized today, is usually the gaze in which a female character lacks any personal agency, plot points, or characteristics outside of being an object for the male character's sexual gratification, a passive object to be looked at or used for as a trophy. In writing, this can come out in a variety of ways. Usually it's used to describe a male author who writes very shallow caricatures of women and also spends perhaps way too long on descriptions of women's bodies, especially if those descriptions are just biologically inaccurate. There's also a darker underside to this, which I have covered in actually another dedicated video, which is how sexual violence against women is portrayed. In my opinion, some of the more insidious ways that men write women is in the terms of sexual violence, how it is often written in a way that almost glorifies the voyeurism of assault, or written in a way that excuses assaulters, or just uses it way too frivolously as a plot point, as if that is the only possible thing that could harm a female character or is the worst thing that could happen to a female character, when other characters, particularly male characters, are allowed to have a wide range of experiences happen to them that can induce character growth. And I've talked a lot about this because it's important to me and I've had to experience it. And I think I've covered it decently on this channel in a variety of ways, just the idea of men writing women. But recently, I'll admit, I came across some comments, and admittedly, they were for one of my favorite authors. So am I biased? Yes. But before I go on, I just want to say, I have admitted when some of my favorite authors do have a little men writing women and get a little male gazy, but I can forgive it because they're great in every other way. So it's not just that. But seeing comments like, "Oh, this was so men writing women," and it's just it's just saying, yes, making a comment about a woman's body. But every description of a woman's body in a book isn't men writing women, right? There's a lot of things you have to consider. And sometimes I think we've gotten a little trigger happy, and I understand it. I feel like sometimes I can fall into this because once you experience something so frequently, you can just get so tired of it that you get a little gun shy on it. But it's some male characters are going to comment on a woman's body very realistically. That is realistic to life. Also, yes, straight female characters may also comment on their own bodies or other female bodies. That is very true to a female experience in general. I get there's a gross way to do it and a not gross way to do it, but just any instance of it isn't men writing women. And also just a lack of understanding of POV. I immediately thought actually of The First Law, which by Joe Abercrombie. If you're new here, I am obsessed with The First Law. And it's like when you think of the first series, are Jezal, West, Logan, and Glokta going to view a woman walking in to a room the same way? No, they have incredibly different viewpoints and different relationships with women, and they're going to sound very differently. So just because a character maybe has a sexist viewpoint, especially in fantasy when we have lots of viewpoints, you can, see if the author is just like making a point, or if like, yeah, every viewpoint is the same. So just like, not all descriptions of women's body, it's not always male gaze. I think when we talk about men writing women, especially for particular authors, we need to see a pattern of behavior before we just like immediately write them off.
So I have some rules for myself now, and that's the first one of them. And also as, what is the current point of view? Like, who's speaking? And could this be considered necessary for the narrative? Does it add something to the story? Or does it just feel like it's there just because the author wants it there?
Now, you might be right now saying, well, what's wrong with men writing women? Just don't read it. You don't need to complain about it. And we're going to put a pin in that, and we're going to come back to it later. So as I was thinking about all this, because I thought about it because of these comments I was seeing, I was like, well, okay, what about women writing men? What's that like? And to be clear, I'm talking about the slang use of that term. So I'm talking specifically about women writing male characters poorly. And the answer is, we do not talk about it nearly as much, if at all. Just look at the differences in visitors to the two subreddits, and the fact that Women Writing Men subreddit was created 2 years later than the Men Writing Women subreddit, and was probably likely created in response to the first subreddit. This can also be seen by the fact that we talk a lot about the male gaze when we talk about men writing women, but there really isn't a comparable phrase for the opposite, because the term female gaze does not mean the lens in which women view men, and in fact, it is another feminist term describing what it is for other women to view women, or how females view other females. And it is usually used in a very positive connotation, as if this was created by the female gaze means that women portrayed in the female gaze have agency and character depth and are more well-rounded and not defined by a masculine counterpart. Another thing I want to add to this discussion is it seems like anytime I talk about subjects close to men writing women on my channel, anybody who's angered by that usually hits back with a very particular response, which is like, well, what about women writing men? Have you seen the romance genre? Now, I do actually want to look at the romance genre today, but what strikes me as odd about this particular defense is it's generally coming from people who do not read romance themselves. Rather, they're hitting back with something that is an expectation of bad writing from things they have heard but not personally experienced. It's not that the romance genre doesn't have that problem, it's that people often talking about it haven't directly experienced it in the way that women have directly experienced men writing women in their favorite genre, like how I talk about it in SFF. This is interesting to me because that means they're using it much more as a deflection tool to not actually deal with the criticisms to an author or book they like, rather than really trying to engage in a good faith discussion on problems like women writing men. But that's okay because I'm going to dive into it for them. So I did have some expectations when I went into this research about what I thought I would find. I thought if I'm looking up women writing men poorly, I'm probably going to see a lot of stuff about maybe women writing men too weak or writing them incompetent and that being really frustrating, or maybe writing men too much like they write women, so like over feminizing them. And that's actually just not what I found at all. So on my searches throughout the internet and asking my following, which by the way, when I was searching on the internet, it led me to clicking on a BuzzFeed article in a year 2025, and I feel like that does entitle me to compensation. Anyway, what I mostly found within that research is men were complaining about over-sexualization of men's bodies, especially when they were unrealistic, annoyance with every male character being sex-obsessed, flat personality-less characters that all seem the same and all seem to have one personality, which was like brooding and hot. And they often complain that these characters seem to be self-insert blanks for the female reader. In short, their complaints seemed almost exactly the complaints that women have about men writing women poorly, in that they didn't want men to be over-sexualized characters without agency or personality. Who would have thought? So why then do we think that men writing women is such a bigger topic and we rarely hear about the opposite of women writing men? Well, I have some theories, and it requires us to think and consider about the broader social context. First, I want to say that I did go to my Instagram and asked my male followers that if they loved romance to talk to me about how they felt men were written in romance. And I actually got a huge response. I did not expect to have so many men who were invested and liked romance. Particularly, I think I asked for romantasy, and most of the responses I got agreed that men in these romance or romantasy novels were mostly flat, but it didn't bother them that much because it was expected and they just kind of got over it. And with me saying that, I think there's probably going to be a certain gut reaction of a certain subset of people watching this video that's like, well, yeah, that's because men don't complain so much and women are just whiners and they just need to get over it because like men can get over it. I'm like, no, I actually don't think that's it. Time to pull out one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite nonfiction books, and I definitely have quoted this at least in 2 other videos, but you guys get to hear it again. And it is from the book Invisible Women: Data Bias in a World Designed for Men by Caroline Criado Perez. The result of this deeply male-dominated culture is that the male experience, the male perspective, has come to be seen as universal, while the female experience, that of half the global population after all, is seen as, well, niche. I think the bigger issue here is that when women are complaining about this, they're often complaining about it in books that are incredibly well received. They are the most popular books of our time. They are on the must-read classics list. They are being studied in school. These are the books that are considered the most well-regarded. Whereas the genre that men most hit us back with is romance, a genre that very historically has been ridiculed, not taken seriously, and viewed specifically as a genre for women, not a genre that is universal. This, I think, is key to understanding the differences in these two topics. I would love it if there were more examples of women writing men poorly in the genre of literary fiction, which is a genre that has a lot more respect in general and tends to, even though be widely female read, again, comes with a little bit more respect and a little bit more of like a universal attitude. That said, I did want to see if I could get some more information on women writing men poorly, so I did go to Instagram and asked my followers this. If you are male, what is an example of a female author writing a male character badly? Some rules. 1, you have to have personally experienced reading it, and 2, it did not come from a romance or romance adjacent novel. I wanted to see what was out there outside of the romance genre, which I feel like is kind of a different thing altogether for the things I previously described. And I want to try to kind of even the playing field and see if I could find genres or books that were really highly regarded and like classics where this was a phenomenon. And for the most part, out of hundreds of responses I got, men said they struggled to come up with examples that were outside of the romance genre. And several people told me that they could think of examples, but the problem was in those books, the women were also written very poorly. So they felt it didn't really count because they felt the whole book was poorly written, not just specifically that the men were poorly written, which I think is a very important distinction for them to bring up, because often in books where I see men writing women, it is in books where I feel like the male characters are written very well. I also love that distinction because this year I did try a couple romance books. We'll talk about that at my end of year wrap up. I'm trying to grow. I tried 3 romance books and I hated them all. And I thought it was because every character was poorly written in them. It wasn't just the men. I thought everyone was poorly written. One funny example that did come up multiple times, I think it was mentioned to me 8 times, which I know probably doesn't sound like a lot as an example, but considering I just widely asked this question with no instance of it having to be a certain genre except outside of romance, and these 8 responses responded with a character from a book series I haven't even covered on my channel, so it's not like something like, oh, they would talk about this because Bookborn talks about this all the time. No, and that was actually Gale from The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins. People said a lot of things, but I think my follower, Andy, boiled it down the best. I think both things are true. Colin shaped Gale to serve the plot, but it also mirrors a bigger pattern in fiction where male characters get boiled down to anger and action. Anger becomes a shortcut for depth, and men turn into protectors, avengers, or threats, instead of fully realized people with quiet vulnerabilities. That's why Gale feels familiar rather than unique. It's also why I love Kaladin and Stormlight Archive so much. He wrestles with pain, responsibility, and depression, but his arc gives space for vulnerability and growth instead of reducing him to just rage or brooding. I found that to be an incredibly insightful comment, especially because I've never really seen female characters boil down to rage in the way that Andy is describing. So that commentary feels very unique to men specifically in the terms of how they are represented in media and how female writers can get it wrong. And it was also pretty similar to why other people complained about Gale, and what I think is very important is that I didn't think that. I quite liked both Gale and Peeta's representations when I read The Hunger Games. In fairness, I haven't read them in a really long time. Like, I read them in my early 20s, and I read them a couple of times, but I have not read them since then, and so that's been a while, so maybe I'd feel differently now. But I liked that example for that reason. Ultimately, yes, there were some other one-off answers, but the consensus generally was, for why I described earlier, that people struggled coming up with examples. And I think this just may circle back to the idea that a lot of media we consume is predicated on the idea that the male experience is universal, while the female experience is niche. Now, I had already had that thought as the outline in my video when one of my followers, Will, hit me with this. I do think, though, that it's probably easier for women to write men. So much of our media and culture is male-centric by osmosis, most women writers will probably have picked up enough that if they tried hard, they could get a convincingly male character down. Shots fired! But also I think it's just like a slightly different twist on what I've already been saying, which is perhaps because women have been studying and seeing and experience media that is so often through the male lens and the male perspective that we may have an advantage when it comes to writing those things because we have considered the male perspective our whole lives. Is that true? Not necessarily. I just think it is a compelling theory. All that to say, I think women writing men definitely exists, and I think it has a lot of the same problems as the opposite, but due to society and how we interact in it, it's just talked about a lot less. And I hazard a guess to say that on the whole, male readers will find that it affects them less than female readers. But I am sure you guys can leave a lot of comments about that below. Let me know if I'm wrong about that. Oh, and I also had this question that really has nothing to do with the video, but I can't help but pose it, which is, if women writing men was less of a problem in romance, would more men read the romance genre? And would I like it more? Weigh in.
Editing Bookborn here. You know, this video by format necessity has become a little hard on the romance genre. And I just want to say, I love you romance readers. I love you romantasy readers. I want you here. I know some of this must feel unfair, and I don't want it to come off as if I'm trashing your genre, because I just really hate it when people get on their high horse about which genres are good and bad. Like, we have to deal enough with that as it is in SFF. And I've done research on the romance genre, and I know it truly does have a rich history. And it's not the point of this video, but like, I'm not saying that romance shouldn't exist. It should. We're just looking at it right now because it is unfortunately like a convenient example in this framework. But I just really don't want anyone here to use this as an excuse to other those readers, because I want them here and they're worthwhile readers, and that's not something I would ever do on this channel.
One aspect I want to touch on briefly before we wrap up the video is the idea of demographics, because this entire conversation relies very heavily on the stereotypes of the certain demographic of the straight cis individual. Like, the idea of men writing women and women writing men relies so heavily on our socialized perceptions of gender, and that is kind of like a nuance I often see missing from these conversations and how that might shape what's going on. The problem is it's just like a really hard topic to discuss. I often think of a quote that I read from another nonfiction book called Of Boys and Men by Richard V. Reeves. Now, this book was about like the school system and education and economics and like important topics. And so I'm gonna read a quote from it, and I need you to stick with me because I promise I have a point with it. Average differences between groups should not influence how we view individuals. That is what most people call stereotyping and economists call statistical discrimination. Even if, on average, women are wired to be a little more nurturing, which they are, it does not mean that my son cannot be an excellent, caring, and empathetic teacher of young children, which he is. You can probably think of some women who are not very nurturing. If you are hiring into a job where nurturing is important, focus on the individual, not their sex. Okay, so I realize what we're talking about today is just not that serious, but this idea has resonated with me in so many aspects of life, which is like, yes, we are going to talk about trends because trends are interesting and trends can teach us a lot about a variety of topics, but we can never confuse or falsely conflate trends and generalities with the individual. And in fact, the reason so many of these discussion videos, I think, tend to prompt so much discussion, and particularly discussion of individual experiences, is because as individuals, we rarely fit the mold of every generalization. So sometimes I hesitate when we talk about genres or stories that are made for men or are made for women. What does that even mean in the broader context? Is it okay if we say that certain genres or books are for that demographic? They're just for men, they're just for women. Well, of course it's okay. Just speaking personally as a woman who has often found herself in male-dominated spaces through, my college major, work, and hobbies, sometimes it can feel very disorienting when I bring up problems of men writing women and the response is, well, this genre just isn't for you. That story just wasn't for you. And it's like, well, SFF has been my favorite genre my whole life. And I like hundreds of stories. So can the answer really just be, it's not for me? Is every criticism of a book going to boil down, well, it's just not for your demographic? And this works the other way too, by the way, especially when we talk about romance. Ultimately, we are going to view all of this out of our own personal lens and our own personal experiences. And so while we talk about these wide trends, which are true, these trends do exist, we just can't ever lose sight of the individual experience within it. As this last part of demographics, I also just want to bring up that anything I talked about when I was interviewing my Instagram followers is that I was specifically interviewing male readers of SFF, which I think is a very interesting subset of a demographic. I don't know how they would differ, but in my head, they probably do differ than if I were to go out and ask the perfect random assortment of men. And I just think that's another interesting demographic to keep in mind. So anyway, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if a male writer writes females crappy or the other way around. Well, no, it doesn't really if you just don't care about half of your demographic, I guess. It really just matters as an author if you care. And as a reader, it doesn't really affect you. If people want to complain about stuff that you like because of this, it doesn't really affect you. I guess this mostly affects maybe authors who have a future in writing, or I think it's always just nice to critically examine the things we love. I've talked about that a lot. I have favorite authors, favorite books that I can also understand that perhaps, there are some flaws, and that's okay. Ultimately, I think these conversations always come down to the same thing, which is good writing is good writing. Generally, authors who can write good characters can universally do it. Not always, but for the most part. And good characters are good characters regardless of their gender identity. Anyway, this was just a deep dive on a topic that I just randomly got interested in, and I just realized I hadn't given a ton of thought to the whole idea of women writing men. And so let me know your thoughts on this topic. I'm sure many of you who do not follow me on Instagram are gonna want to tell me about a female author that they thought wrote a male character very badly, and I am interested to hear it, I won't lie. So you let me know. Let me know if you think the conclusions I had about that are correct in your experience. Yeah, just tell me it all. And if you like these kind of deep dives, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.